Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Nicole Sharp, and I'm the parent of Sloan, who is class of 31. So, this awesome event is being brought to you by the Bryn Mawr Schools Parent Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background before we get started, but I don't want to waste too much time so we could really give all of our time to the panel. So, some of you may be asking, what is the Parent Committee of Diversity and Inclusion? So, just to give you a snapshot for those of you who may not know, we have three main goals that our committee does, and it's to build and facilitate community dialogue amongst parents on important issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity to support students and build a stronger Bryn Mawr community. Also, to raise awareness and sensitivity on issues of race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomic status, class, diversity, and also current events, and work with the administration to help our school respond to said current events. And then finally, to foster an inclusive environment for all social and ethnic groups at Bryn Mawr and celebrate the community as a whole. The leaders of the Parent Diversity Committee consist of the following parents: Robert Motley, whose daughter Sarah is class of 27, myself, as I mentioned earlier, parent Kendra McKenzie, whose daughter Mackenzie is class of 25, and parent Teresa Jones, whose daughter Brielle is also class of 31. And then finally, why are we all here tonight? What are some of the objectives that we have? So the parent committee wanted to present a program to you all that was quote unquote different and steeped in history and learning for our beloved community here at Bryn Mawr. So this event is basically, as stated in the announcement, rooted in the Black Alumni Yearbook, and you will hear from some of those folks, and also the History Project, Examining Our Past. And so we present to you this awesome panel discussion, and we're looking at basically the history of Bryn Mawr through what we've called a diverse lens. Please place any questions that you have in the chat. I'm going to monitor the chat. We hope to get to some of those questions, and please know that we're not trying to skip any questions, but we will do our best to pose those questions to our panel. And then also we hope to have some time at the end of our event for Q&A. Now I have the esteemed pleasure to introduce to you our moderator, who is my friend and also parent of class of 31. We're a little proud of class of 31. So I have the honor of introducing to you all Elizabeth Hurwitz, who is an alum of class of 93, and she's also a parent to Sasha in class of 26 and to Tyson in class of 31. So here's a little bit of background about Elizabeth. So Elizabeth arrived at Bryn Mawr in 1980 and graduated in 1993. She went on to receive a BA from Yale and a master's degree in public health from Boston University. Her varied career has included stints in publishing and public health with a focus on HIV, disability, and innovation. She is currently pursuing coursework in interior design. Elizabeth serves on the Board of Trustees of Baltimore Center Stage and the Baltimore Museum of Art. So Elizabeth's daughters, who I mentioned earlier, have attended Bryn Mawr themselves since the little school. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce Elizabeth, who is my neighbor and my friend.
Wonderful. Let's see. I think I've managed to, no, I'm still here. Hi, folks. So let me start by introducing our panel. First, I'll introduce Claire Rubon, who is Bryn Mawr's archivist and who formerly served as the middle school librarian for 7 years, retiring in 2020. Claire is also the parent of 3 alumni: Zoe, class of 2005, Emily, class of 2008, and Carly, class of 2013. We also have Dr. Kim Long Riley, who graduated from Bryn Mawr in 1979 and went on to receive a PhD in German intellectual and cultural history from Johns Hopkins. She taught at Hopkins for 17 years before returning to Bryn Mawr 9 years ago to teach upper school history. And Kim was the history department chair when Bryn Mawr initiated the history project Examining Our Past, which you'll hear more about later this evening. She has a strong interest in how we craft stories about ourselves and our institutions, and she's committed to teaching complex and inclusive histories. Also here is Dr. Irina Spector-Marx, a graduate of the Bryn Mawr class of 2004. Irina went on to receive her BA in history from Macalester College and her PhD in history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She subsequently returned to the nest as a world history teacher in the upper school, and she's worked over the past 3 years with faculty and students on the Bryn Mawr History Project, Exploring Our Past, about the school's complex and ever-changing relationship with diversity. We also have 3 recent alumni with us. First up, Milan George, class of 2018. She's the co-creator of the Black Alumni Yearbook and now a junior sociology major and design minor attending Howard University. India Kutcherman is a Bryn Mawr alum from the class of 2018. She is currently a junior at National Treasure Morgan State University. You're right, it is, where she is pursuing a degree in social work. And during her time at Bryn Mawr, India worked alongside Milan to help cultivate the Black Alumni Yearbook for her senior project. And last but not least, Katrina Salmon, class of 19, spent several years as a student researching diversity trends as part of the Examining Our Past project, and she is now a sophomore studying sustainable business at NYU. So tonight, we will look together at the history of the school, the narratives we've constructed, and the values our stories reinforce within our community. We're really only just beginning to examine the history of Bryn Mawr through a lens of race, ethnicity, religion, social class, gender, and sexuality. So while tonight's focus will be on the lens of Blackness and whiteness, this conversation is meant as a launching pad. We are a community grappling with a complex past, and this is not the last word. So let's begin with our creation myth. In 1984, on the cusp of the school's 100th anniversary, Bryn Mawr held its first annual Founders Day celebration. And for 30 years, students basked in the tradition of our 5 radical young women founders who believed in educating girls to the same rigorous standards as boys, or better. So Katrina, you were at Bryn Mawr for your whole school career. Can you tell us how Bryn Mawr's story was told when you were a student?
So I came to Bryn Mawr in 2006, and at that point, Founders Day was a strongly established tradition and a very integral part of the fall semester. And at Founders Day every year, and throughout the school year as well, we heard this single sort of foundation story of the school repeated. And it was that in some room somewhere in Baltimore, there were these 5 women, of which we knew almost nothing, who sat down one day and said, "Let's start a school for women." And poof, school existed and became a thing. And we knew very little about who these women were. Certainly I did. I mean, I only knew maybe that Mary Elizabeth Garrett was an heir to the B&O Railroad fortune, and that's how the school was funded. But I knew almost nothing about the other women. I don't even think I could name them if I tried. So it was this very simple story that you could repeat very easily and was always repeated in the same manner.
And I'll open this up if it's useful, but tell me, for you, what values and beliefs did that founding mythology convey to you about our community?
I think one thing that's sort of problematic about it, looking back, is that when you repeat a story so often to such young children, it becomes fact. It wasn't something I ever thought to question. I never thought about who these women were as people or what their views were. It was simply that they were 5 radical women who we should praise and in some ways worship for founding a school for women at a time when that was a radical idea. And we didn't look beyond simply the fact that they'd started a school. And I think that that's proved to be problematic. But at the same time, the story also really emphasized the fact that it was important to educate women and that women deserve to be educated. And that was incredibly important. So there are some positives, some negatives, but I think that now looking back on it, we've realized that that was perhaps not the best way to present the school's history to people, and it didn't encompass the full story.
And to me, growing up, I came to Bryn Mawr in 1980. So, I hadn't, to me, Founders Day felt like it had always been there. I was shocked to learn that it was a tradition that was created very deliberately when I was in 3rd or 4th grade. And I felt like it it set up a few narratives. One was that these women were at the forefront of social change, and that was sort of a positive driving force for good. The other piece of it, or another piece of it, was, and this also is part of our celebration of Edith Hamilton as the first real headmistress of the school. She was a scholar who wrote the very seminal adaptations of Greek myths called The Greek Way, and had many other accomplishments to her name. But the school really established Greek civilization as sort of the pinnacle of achievement. So there was that Western civilization skew, that we were in this tradition. And the other piece of it for me was this value in sisterhood. And that became a really positive piece of the narrative. Does anyone want to add anything else before we start to take a look at this story from another angle?
Can I just say that one of the things that was striking to me was, as I said to you before, since I was graduated in 1979, we didn't have a Founders Day. So when I came back to teach, it was so surprising to me to see it and to see what the narrative was. And actually my first reaction to it, after many people were like, aren't you so excited? It's Founders Day. And I was like, it doesn't mean anything. But as I watched it, I thought, this has really grown into quite a myth, quite a, as I think Katrina said, simple and kind of praising in a way that I don't know that really any transformational leaders necessarily need, because whenever you examine lives of real people, they often begin to fall short. So it was like, I could almost see it being set up. I don't know, Irina, if you want to add any more. I think it had also almost that time become, it was interesting. I think I remember a faculty member said, as a gay faculty member, I felt so much pride in the founders when that part of the story became public. And that was another thing that I think was happening maybe 10, 15 years ago, where that was no longer hidden. So it then had a lift, and then I think came crashing down as people began to question it in 2016.
So let's take a different approach to, so now India and Milan, you both came a little bit later to Bryn Mawr. And so the founding mythology maybe wasn't quite as ingrained in your experience. And before we talk about the events of 2016, will you talk to us about what your introduction to the Bryn Mawr community was like?
I'll go first. For me, I'm attending Bryn Mawr. So I attended Bryn Mawr for my high school experience. And so Bryn Mawr was different than anything that I had ever experienced in my life. Not only was I in a different environment and amongst a different community, I was also made very aware that I was in a different environment and that I was different in that community. And so the girls would let me know, my classmates would let me know that just in little microaggressions of, why do you talk like that? Or why do you have these certain mannerisms? And so that was very different for me because, like I had said, I've never been in an environment like Bryn Mawr, which essentially means being around so many white people. That was my first experience, being around so many white people. And so attending Bryn Mawr, that was just where I was really made aware that I was different. And so growing up, my mom really tried her best to shield me from the inevitable racism and discrimination that I would experience as a Black person. And so she tried to hold on to that as long as she could until I attended high school. And so, like I said, it was just something that I had never experienced before.
I came in 2013, same as India, and our experience were very similar. I came in as a freshman, and like India, before Bryn Mawr, I went to a predominantly Black Baptist private school. So it was also my first experience with the PWI and also with like an entire school that did not look like me. And it was also the first time that I didn't have any Black teachers or like any Black adults that I kind of learned from, things like that, except Miss Titus and Miss Rice. And I guess in more like a broader social scope, like in the fall in 2013. I remember we had a forum on the death of Michael Brown and the Ferguson uprising. And in the spring, we had, it was the death of Freddie Gray. And it was also during the Baltimore uprising, and gym drill was canceled. And we had a lot of discussions about that, things like that. But more personally, I found, even though it was my first experience in the PWI, I found a lot of community through BSU and African Connection. I remember I saw those two tables at the club fair and I got really excited because I was like, oh, I've never been a part of a BSU because I didn't need to be. But, and also Cafe, I also found community there, and like, I really enjoyed being in Cafe.
And for the alumni who may not be as familiar with these terms, PWI is predominantly white institution. Am I right about that? And BSU is Black Student Union. And Cafe, tell us how Cafe differs from Black Student Union.
So CAFE stands for Community Alliance for Everyone, and that is an all-school organization like SGA or Athletic Association. So you get representatives from each grade, and like also like a president, vice president, secretary. And BSU was a club, Black Student Union, so anyone just came to BSU.
Yeah. And before sort of everything, before the events that we're going to talk about later in 2016, what understanding did you have about the Founders Day story, the story of the history of the school? Was that something that you thought about?
I didn't really, like Katrina was saying, that she had it more ingrained in her since she started from such a young age. But Founders Day for me, I remember it was just like a really hot day that we sat outside and listened to people talk. And I listened to the story and I thought it was interesting how someone could start a school. And I thought it was interesting how they valued education so much. So yeah.
Yeah. So by 2016, Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania had begun to grapple with the legacy of M. Carey Thomas, who played an important role in the early life of both Bryn Mawr College and the Bryn Mawr School. So Milan and India now take us back to 2016. Remind us, if you don't mind, of the broader events that brought tensions on campus to a boiling point.
So there were a lot of events in 2016 that I was recently reminded of because I think I just pushed them back, but I remembered them for this panel. So of course we had the elections in 2016, which was a big kind of rift, I think, in our community because people felt very passionate, as was expected, but also you had the musical that a lot of people also kind of protested because there were no leads of color in the musical, so people kind of felt, I guess, left out. And also we had the house system, and we had Asante Campbell's convocation about the founders, and it kind of brought out people's feelings about how the founders did not envision Bryn Mawr as a place for girls of color, students of color to go to. And also we had the deaths of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, and kind of I guess, blowing out of the Black Lives Matter movement, that becoming more, I guess, a news topic. Yeah, and the house system also that.
Yeah. Will you say a word or two about, it doesn't have to be you. Well, one of the students or faculty who was there at the time explain the house system that was set up in 2015 or 16? So the house system was meant to, I was a parent at this point, the house system was meant to instill school spirit, and in keeping with the founders, the founding mythology, the houses were named in honor of each of the founders. And so it was in that context, with the revelations from Bryn Mawr College, and it sounds like with the convocation of one of your classmates, Asante Campbell, is that right? Yeah, that everyone on campus was now enlightened, to what was never a secret, but was never part of the narrative thread that Bryn Mawr had constructed for itself, which was that there was a strong vein of racism among at least one of the founders. And let's zoom out for 1 second. And of course, all of this is in the context of everything else that's happening in 2016. So I want to zoom out again for a second, and let's talk to Claire for a moment and I want to talk about our founders, so we can really get a clear view of what their legacy is, both incredibly influential and positive, and also really hurtful and negative. So Claire, first tell us, when we talk about the Bryn Mawr Archive, we're a school that was founded in 1885. What are the materials that we have to rely on when we're looking back at our history?
Well, we have school records, like kind of the basic records like Board of Trustees minutes and the head records and some other records from different departments. And then we have the school publications, which really kind of document what goes on at the school. So we have certainly the yearbooks, we have quills, we have publications from the communications office and what have you. We have, documents like the commencement programs and things like that. So that's what we have. And then we also have things that people have given to the archives that they feel are of historical value. So we have some kind of accounts of things that happen in history. We have alumni memories and things like that.
Great. And from those early years, are there perspectives that are notably missing?
Well, from the early years, we don't have lots, because the founders' papers are really held at other institutions. So we don't have lots and lots of the very early stuff, but we have the original, documents for the founding of the school and that type of thing. In terms of the story, I think I believe that probably the founders were the ones who were telling that story, and I guess the founders, within a number of years, kind of disbanded. And so I think then the story was really kind of cultivated, I would say probably most by M. Carey Thomas, who kind of held she exerted quite a bit of control in the school, as did Mary Garrett. But M. Carey Thomas was probably one who would be kind of crafting the story a bit.
And fair to say, the other institutions hold plenty of documents because these women were real public figures. So the historical record is very full, right? Rich and full. So how about, let's see, how about Irina? Would you talk to us about what made our founders revolutionary, and what their legacy is beyond Bryn Mawr even?
Sure. So I think certainly in the suffrage movement, Mary Garrett particularly, there's a biography of her that, what's the phrase, Kim, that it uses? Like a manipulative philanthropist. It's not manipulative, but that's the meaning of it, right? That she basically used her money as leverage to get what she wanted. So you can see that with Hopkins, with the medical school, where she insisted, the story that we get told at Bryn Mawr is that she insisted that women were admitted on equal terms with men to the medical school. And that's a really, really important part. But as we were researching more, we realized even more than that, she was actually the person who made Hopkins into the medical school that it became in a lot of ways. She was the one who said, here are certain academic standards that the medical students coming into Hopkins have to meet. That was not something that the Hopkins folks were really thinking about beforehand. And there wasn't sort of, at the time, standards for what doctors had to meet. That medical degree training was not really, it was much less regulated than it is now.
Can I just add one thing? M. Carey Thomas's, let's see, brother-in-law was Flexner, who wrote the whole report for American universities and the creation of standards. And so that family was really in the mix of that. And then I think the other thing, there's so few things that someone who studies German history gets to know, but M. Carey Thomas had studied in Germany and gotten her PhD there. And that was part of this bringing back of a German university system, which was the best in the world at the time, and insisting that Hopkins follow that model. They really should give those women far more credit than they are ever given for creating a world-class medical institution. So it's, that's where you're kind of like, oh, wow, there's that, it's pretty big.
And how revolutionary was it to have founded a girls' school with these tremendously rigorous standards?
I think the piece, it's funny, it gets said every year at Founders Day, and I don't think the meaning of it gets explained, which is that it was the first college preparatory school for girls. This is not to say that there weren't other schools that could prepare girls for college or did prepare girls for college, but the founders at Bryn Mawr were so concerned that their vision for women's education would be undermined that they laid down requirements for graduation, namely that you had to pass the Bryn Mawr College entrance exam, whether you were going to go there or not, whether you even wanted to go to college or not, you had to pass it in order to get your diploma from Bryn Mawr High School. And that was their way of sort of protecting this is going to be an academic institution. They really, if you read, they had quite a lot of fears that parents or the broader community would undermine that vision. And they actually got quite a lot of pushback from parents. My daughter is of a nervous disposition. She shouldn't have to take math. And they would say, yes, she does if she wants to go here. There's even some joking that they do with each other where they're like, well, of course we wouldn't allow music lessons because that's a finishing school pursuit. So I think the sort of the sole single-minded focus on a college degree is what sets it apart.
The original curriculum would make you cry. I mean, it's incredible how demanding it was. It was Latin, Greek, French, German, higher math. It's just extraordinary level.
Right, and I think we can also add that that the founders were involved in, they were really are regarded as founders of Bryn Mawr College as well. And so M. Carey Thomas was a very early dean and was really involved in drafting, and she and Mamie Gwynn were involved in drafting the curriculum and really setting that school's standards so high so that it was an equivalent to the Ivy League schools. And so it was really all about standards.
And Kim, another area where the founders of the school were really influential was in the area of suffrage. Is that right?
Yes, and I think M. Carey Thomas was part of the founding of the League of University Women and the suffrage vote and organization of university women pro-suffrage movement. And she and Mary Garrett were also part of, what did they call it, Irina? Again, like the society program, where it used to be that suffrage was considered kind of a middle-class woman's concern. And they, along with several other women, got this kind of into a more upper-class milieu and began to get the backing of sort of name brand people and really sort of catapulted suffrage into a much more fashionable and popular movement. I would say with the school, M. Carey Thomas was very interested in what we would call branding. And she had this idea that there would be a Bryn Mawr girl that would be something like the Eton, Cambridge, Oxford, or Harvard, the Princeton, Yale equivalent for girls, so that you would see that woman and you would know by her unbelievable brain and her polish where she came from. And I think, at a time when women had very little power, that it maybe sounds to us snobby or silly, but I think she was imagining a very powerful breed of women coming out of these institutions, who would be for the, and also, and suffrage, part of the suffrage movement.
And on the flip side of all of this incredible influence is this part of the story that Bryn Mawr has not made part of its narrative. Can you talk, Irina, about the historical evidence of racism?
Sure. So I think it's easiest to see for M. Carey Thomas. Hers is the most blatant. And I think two things that really struck us as we were researching this that are disheartening because they run counter to the narrative about how anti-racism should work. One is that her racism grew over the course of her lifetime, that you can see particularly her investment and belief in eugenics just escalate and escalate and escalate over the course of her lifetime. And the second is that she really, and this is part of it, changed over the course of her lifetime. It got more racist as she went on. But she really deviated from her parents. This was not something that she picked up at home. Her parents were Quakers. Her mother was a suffragist activist who actually had Black suffragists over to her house for tea when M. Carey Thomas was growing up. And M. Carey Thomas later in life famously Mary McLeod Bethune was invited to speak at Bryn Mawr College, and M. Carey Thomas refused to have lunch with her. She could speak at the college, but wouldn't eat with her. And so I think those are some of the most disheartening pieces and shocking pieces, because this is something that she actively embraced and leaned into over time. I think with the other founders, we know most about Thomas. I would say second most about Garrett. Probably the other founders we have less information on. Certainly Garrett's family, some of her family members were embroiled with the Confederate cause during her early childhood. It's some relation members.
Wasn't it a fight, Irina, in the family? It was sort of odd. The father had sided with the North because of the B&O Railroad. That was their money came from. And he wanted, for his own sort of business reasons, I don't know if it had anything to do with sort of philosophy, for business reasons, thought the North would be the better side. But the brothers all were trying to run away. In fact, one of them did, to join the Confederate cause. So the family itself was split in its loyalty. I mean, not uncommon in Maryland at the time.
And the reason why Lake Roland was renamed Robert E. Lee Park before it was renamed Lake Roland again in 2016, I think it was renamed, or 2017, it was in a will of a relative of Garrett. So clearly she's very much in that Southern Baltimore Confederate sympathizers circles. We don't have as much of the red flags ringing out in her writing as we do for Thomas, but it would not surprise me. And then I think there's other evidence we can look at. So for example, I mean, we're really focusing on Black and white here, but there was a debate amongst the founders about whether or not to admit Jewish students. And there's a split in the founders over that. And so I think you could also look at, well, who sided on that, and maybe make some speculations about what that would mean in terms of their respective racisms.
I think if I can just add something, a story that really stood out to me as a student that Dr. Spector Marks and Dr. Riley brought to the history department, or to the history project, was the story of M. Carey Thomas, that while she was serving as a dean at Bryn Mawr College, a Black student received a scholarship to the school. And rather than to allow a Black student to admit her to come to her institution, she paid for this woman's tuition to go to Cornell.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And I think that really tells you a lot about her personal beliefs and the lengths she was willing to go to keep her institution white.
It also suggests that we can't now say we see Cornell accepting a Black student. Help us understand the sort of the racism and white supremacy of our founders in the context in which they lived.
Well, I think M. Carey Thomas in a certain way, and part of the reason Irina, you can disagree with me, but part of the reason maybe she moved to become more racist was that she was very involved with some professors at Harvard who were certainly part of the scientific racism development of this philosophy. And I think she just increasingly in her context bought what was for many people becoming the quote unquote science of the time. So and she was so I think impressed by anything academic. I would imagine that part of her attitudes were embracing eugenics. Again, that wasn't certainly everyone, but it was a growing movement during her lifetime. Her lifetime coincides with the growth of scientific racism and eugenics, both of which she embraces.
And what is the impact that those views may have had on the Bryn Mawr School during the lifetime of the founders and beyond?
I think one really great example of the impact, because it is so hidden, is the move to Roland Park. So Roland Park is founded as a covenanted neighborhood in the 1890s. So covenants were included in the deed that you would sign when you signed your house, and they were for the most part about how to maintain the standards again of the neighborhood. And a lot of that was about what you can build, or, you know, how you had to keep your shrubbery. You couldn't have pigs, right? That was a very poor person thing to do. But there were also racial restrictions in the covenants for Roland Park and for many other neighborhoods around the country. And eugenics is a huge part of the progressive era movement that's shaping that drive of white people towards the suburbs, in that they are concerned with not only escaping, I think, the people themselves of other races, which you can see in the restrictive covenants, but they're also concerned with a larger, what is the progress of society look like? The progress of society should be nature, it should be outdoors, it should be neighborly, but only certain types of neighbors. And so this belief that you have to keep the neighborhood constrained and restricted in so many ways to preserve it. And Bryn Mawr moves out from Mount Vernon to Bryn Mawr. It actually takes them a while because the Great Depression gets in their way, but they move out from 28 to 33. They're gradually moving students out here. And if you look at some of the causes that were propelling them, there's a parent letter with complaints about that the situation of the old school was very detrimental to students, in that they were exposed to the noise and dirt and sickness of the city, the noise of the trolley cars, and the quote unquote Negro invasion in the adjoining neighborhoods. And so it all gets tied together: the dirtiness of the city, the crowdedness of the city, the noisiness of the city, the criminality and unsafetyness of the city, and the blackness of the city. And I think we could look around and say that happens a lot in discourses today around Baltimore City. And our school continues to be in Roland Park and continues to represent largely a particular demographic. That, I think, is a really strong undercurrent of continuity.
Yeah. With impact on the larger infrastructure of Baltimore City schools as well. And although those covenants have been removed, I think there's no question that we live in a divided Baltimore that's very much reflective of our history. So this is a great segue to leap out. So Melissa, this is your shining moment to share a visual, if you don't mind. We've jumped from the middle of the story to the end, the beginning and back. We're going to now look at some key dates in our 135-year diversity story, and at some key dates in the way that we've shaped this single cohesive narrative. As you've heard, in 1885, the school was founded by these 5 young women. And we've just heard about Bryn Mawr's relocation to Roland Park. And then we come to 1954, when the Supreme Court decides in Brown v. Board of Education that public schools must be integrated. And Bryn Mawr in 1954 opts against integration. So, Claire, what do we know about the response of the Bryn Mawr community to Brown v. Board of Education? What were the pressures to integrate and the pressures to exclude in those years?
Well, certainly the school was looking at the question of whether or not to integrate within in less than a year after Brown. And they established a committee to kind of investigate it and makes the recommendations. And the committee was made of alumni and some faculty. Catherine Van Bibber was on it. And they there was a feeling that the school would integrate, but it was a matter of would they do it then. They did a survey of the alumni, and about 1/3 of the people responded, and 2/3 were opposed to integration. And the committee, they still considered it, but they decided to opt for gradualism, which was the school will probably integrate, but let's not push things and not move too quickly. So they decided to put it off, and they also stipulated, though, that they would that the school would not be integrated until 18 months after the announcement was made. And so that just put things off. In terms of what, at that time, probably one of the biggest uh, pressures not to integrate had to do with having Black and white girls socializing together. And there was a great fear in the community about miscegenation and that type of thing. So I don't know if that answered the question fully. Perhaps Irene or Kim.
Irina, maybe you have something to add.
What's that?
I was wondering if Kim or Irina had anything to add.
I was just remembering a story because I think the alumni are one set of constituents, the students are one set of constituents, the parents are one set of constituents. There were actually two faculty members who were Jewish who actually resigned in protest over the decision not to integrate the school. That kind of coming out of the Holocaust and World War II, they felt like they couldn't stand by while that decision was made. And there's a very moving letter that a junior student in her junior year wrote to the board in, Claire, you'll know, but I think
I think it was probably 60, and then in 61, that kind of by then, by 60, there was a lot of move towards integrating. So by then, Catherine Van Bibber, who was the head of school, she really deep down in her heart wanted the change, but the community was kind of resisting. And she had decided to retire. And there was some feeling that she wanted the policy changed before she retired, and she was going to retire in June of 61. And then a student, Judith Sullivan, she wrote a letter in I think the fall of 60, saying that this is against what we're taught here at Bryn Mawr. We're very clearly taught values and character, and this is not in keeping. And then also they had begun looking for a new head of school, and Diane Howell was the candidate they were interviewing, and she said she wouldn't come unless they integrated the school. So there was it was just time. And then they very quickly in January of 61 moved forward and changed the policy.
I just want to acknowledge as an editorial comment that this concept of gradualism with regards to rights feels very, very painful. And I think that it's something that we have to keep in the forefront of our minds. It's an argument, a pragmatic argument that's still made today in conversations about rights. And as we look at learning from our history, I think this is a theme to bear very much in mind. And while I think that people have wrong views about why it's important to not mix or whatever, there was clearly a financial concern as well, because in 1962, when Bryn Mawr did give notice, 18 months warning, we're integrating. They did it in a very careful way. And I guess, let's see, Irina, can you explain the decision that was made in conjunction with Roland Park Country School?
So they, well, I'll tell you what I remember, and then you can tell me if this wasn't what you were looking for. They lay out the announcement, we will integrate, but 18 months. And they do that very deliberately with the expectation that some parents will pull their children from school. It's a warning of, you know, if you're not on board for this, you're going to need to leave. And probably also to give them time, if they could, to convince those parents to stay in order, as you say, financially to keep the tuition dollars there. They make it very clear in the announcement, it will only be qualified students of color. And Bryn Mawr is not lowering its academic standards in any way. It will only be the highest qualified, you know, that point gets reiterated over and over and over again.
I think it's also interesting to note that the schools all kind of, in other words, maybe not colluded, but got to get, I mean, that schools were integrating as each other did in Baltimore, so that they were going to be a group and rather having one stick out and one. So there's a lot of discussion between schools too, I think as well.
Yeah.
That's right. I remember reading that Roland Park and Bryn Mawr, just like, you know, states worry if the tax is a little bit lower just over the border, that Bryn Mawr, I suppose, in not wanting the students to flee to Roland Park Country, they would only do it together, 1, 2, 3, go. And I think that tells us a lot about some of the arguments maybe that would have played into the decision.
Can I just one more aside about the money? I think in Irina also you can jump in, but one of the things that that was really shocking to me when we were doing this history, you know, Bryn Mawr has always had sort of operated on a shoestring, and it's had a lot of very difficult financial times in its past. It's never had as much money as, say, a school like Gilman. At one point in time, Mary Garrett had a lot of money that she gave to M. Carey Thomas. She spent it traveling in a very frivolous way. I always think it was money that could have secured a future for Bryn Mawr financially, that would have given it freedom to make the right choice and right choices, and not to have to compromise all the time with public opinion. And yet that did not happen. That money went in, and Irina, don't you remember us reading about, like, she carried her own champagne kind of thing with her when she traveled? I mean, enormous personal expenditure at the end of her life, and not the kind of influential, you know, money giving that they had originated with. So it's just unfortunate, because I think this moment of integration is another one where, because of the lack of funds, the board and the school has to be very, you know, sort of careful with what it's doing.
So Milan in India, I think you're best equipped to pick up the story here. In 1968, Ursel Datcher becomes Bryn Mawr's first Black graduate. And we'll talk in a moment about how you came to your expertise, but tell us now about what we know about Ursel and what we know about the response of the community to the enrollment of the first Black student.
So a lot of, I think I can speak for both of us, a lot of what we know really comes from a news article that was written in the Baltimore Sun. I think that's what it was called in the 60s, that Milan actually had found off of the internet. She's going to share the screen. And so the article this article in general talks about the first Black students that had integrated some of Baltimore's independent schools. So the article, the section about Ursel, talks about how she was really well accepted by her classmates. She was voted like the president of the athletic association. And so that kind of helps us to understand, to a certain extent, that she was accepted. But as you had mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, Baltimore is a very divided Baltimore. And so while the students may have accepted her and liked her as a person, still sure that she still faced many things. She was still discriminated against, and she experienced that in her daily life. And she actually passed away before me and Milan had even come in contact with like knowing who she was as the first Black Bryn Mawr student. So we never got a chance to speak with her, but I do know that Michelle Eubanks, who was class of 1969, she had talked about how she had earned really good grades, but the teachers weren't able to give her an A on for her final grades. And so they would give her a B plus plus. I mean, so I'm sure that those are some of the things that Ursel also experienced. But like I said, we weren't able to meet her to really get an understanding of her real authentic experience.
Anything to add, Milan?
Just that, yeah, this article that I found before we started the Black Alumni Yearbook, this is kind of like what started it. I think I was looking at archives and like newspapers in Baltimore, and then I came across this. And so, yeah, this was the program that kind of introduced a lot of Black students into independent schools in Baltimore. You can see Ursel Datcher here, Robert McCauley from Friends School, Dunbar High School, Park School, and Notre Dame Prep. So yeah.
And I see a request in the chat if you have a PDF that you can pop into the chat. I know people will love to read it closer. And am I correct? It's hard to see in the black and white that the article is celebrating the white woman whose program identified students who would excel at the various private schools in Baltimore?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's also talking about how they won college scholarships, things like that.
Anything else we need to know about this woman and her project?
Her name was Maurice Ross. I couldn't find anything else in the newspaper. I remember when I was looking it up, just Ursel Datcher's name that stood out to me. But yeah, she basically found inner city Black children that like excelled in school and things like that, and helped them get into independent schools.
And so let's hop back. Anything else to say right now? We'll return to the subject. But maybe we can hop back for a second to the timeline and find ourselves back in the 1980s. So Melissa, if you want to share that slide one more time. We have mentioned the invention of Founders Day in 1984. And let's talk first about what was going on in education in the 1980s. There was a trend toward multiculturalism. So Claire, Kim, or Irina, can you tell us what that educational movement looked like?
I think, well, go ahead. I always think of it as fairly like white student centric, where exposure to other people or diverse people was good for you. I mean, maybe someone else can add, but when I think of the original multiculturalism, that seemed to be the perspective that it came from, that it was going to somehow benefit primarily the majority population in the school to be exposed more widely.
I think that's definitely right. I also think it's striking that when the first African-American students were admitted, the school strategy really was, if we just don't mention that they're Black, surely no one will notice. It was very much like, let's keep silent about this. Let's not talk about this. And then I think in the 80s, you see a shift on the part of the school. I think students were already doing it for themselves. Michelle Eubanks, when she came to visit, talked about that before there was a BSU, before there was a Black Student Union, the Black students got together and had the place on campus where they would hang out and talk and support each other. But in terms of sort of curriculum and educational pedagogical import, I think in the 80s, you start to see, let's talk about different people. But still, as Kim says, from the default assumption that we are all white studying those other peoples.
So suddenly we have increased focus on a values curriculum at Bryn Mawr, on foreign exchange programs, on community service, on financial aid, and increased enrollment, I think, in those years, right, among Black students and students of other ethnicity, races and ethnicities as well. But in a context, absolutely, I think that centers the white experience. I think that's and it was in this context then, because at first blush, it sounds like how ironic that in this context of like multicultural awakening, we are suddenly celebrating the founders in this very narrow way. But I think perhaps as we're starting to look at other cultures and their value, maybe we look back at our own white cultural story and codify that as well, without quite knowing maybe that's what we're doing. So the institution of Founders Day is important as an example of what the historian Andrea Hamilton, no relation to Edith as far as I know, surely had in mind when in 2004, she told the Baltimore Sun, and I quote, "Contemporary Bryn Mawr draws only on select parts and specific interpretations of the past in order to justify the present." Andrea Hamilton was at the center of a controversy that arose in the early 2000s when Irina was a student at Bryn Mawr, and I'd love to hear your perspective too. Let's start with Kim, who's actually spoken with Andrea Hamilton, and maybe you can give us a snapshot of what happened in those years.
Well, I think one of the things, you mean about her book, or about,
Yes,
I guess that, yeah. She, the thing that's interesting is I heard about this controversy long before I came back to Bryn Mawr or was even thinking about this project, because there was a big article in the Chronicle of Higher Education about it, because she wrote a history of Bryn Mawr. She used the Bryn Mawr archives. She was planning on publishing it as part of her dissertation work. And then the school, she had signed a clause that allowed them the right of review. And she had a contract already with Johns Hopkins Press, and Bryn Mawr shut that down. And she was told, just sort of all of a sudden, right before publication, this will not go through. The reason the school gave publicly was that it was not a scholarly work. And the reason it was in the Chronicle of Higher Education was because numerous scholars, including the woman who wrote the sort of really big biography of M. Carey Thomas, signed this to support her. Numerous historians. Rebecca Fox, who was the head at the time or just beginning to leave, was a relative of, maybe sister-in-law of Genovese, who's a very famous historian. And she claimed to draw on her own university credentials to make this statement that the book was not, adequate historically. Like I said, I did talk to Andrea. I think this basically ruined her life. She left the country. She now lives in Switzerland and she teaches there. It took her years to get over it. It essentially destroyed her academic career because she ended without any publishable material. And eventually the book was in fact published. She claimed she truly never understood why they were so intent on shutting the book down. And that she was simply told that was it and there would be no further discussion. So I mean, it's a pretty surprising event, I think, in Bryn Mawr's history. And I think we've all speculated, and Irina, you can jump in, or other people, about what it was that was in this book that was so surprising. I think by that time, it was pretty well known that M. Carey Thomas and Mary Garrett and Mamie Gwynn had been in this kind of love triangle. So I don't think it was that. I've often wondered if they had access to the votes on integration, but we don't have evidence for that they would be, that people would not have wanted, I don't know, information about that. There was some speculation that Barbara Chase had taken up this girls needing a different education in her time, and that by the time the book was about to be published, that was becoming seeming old-fashioned. I don't know, Rena, what else would you like to say? But anyway, there was this moment in which Bryn Mawr really suppresses its own history.
I was a senior as this whole scandal was unfolding. And at least amongst the older students and faculty, it was something that was being discussed. I remember having a conversation in advisory and saying to my advisor, like, why won't they publish it? But, as I think often happens at Bryn Mawr, everything was rumors and supposition, and we don't know. I think Kim's identified a range of factors that it might have been. I will say at the time at school, what was being talked about was how scandalous it was to suggest that they were lesbians. And while it may have been well known in academic circles, I don't think it was well known in Bryn Mawr circles. This was 2004. Sodomy had just been, the laws against being gay being illegal in Texas had literally just been struck off the books. That was what people at Bryn Mawr hyper focused on, as that must be the
And in the media, there were also, so there was speculation. The book's published now. You can find it on Amazon and read it.
Really excellent.
And
if you want to understand Bryn Mawr, like, it's stunning.
Yeah, it's really worth. I mean, I've read only quotes from it, but the reviewers said after the book was finally published, we tried and we can't figure out exactly what would have troubled the school. And there's a question in the chat about who would have made the decision. Yes, it was the Board of Trustees that made and that ultimately revised its decision after major pushback from the academic community. And the reason that I wanted to include this in here wasn't, I mean, the board records are sealed, as I understand it, Claire, for 75 years. We won't know in my lifetime the reasoning behind the records being sealed. And some people thought perhaps it was because there was a suggestion that over time, the academic standards of the founders had been relaxed. So we will never know. But the point that I wanted to make by including this here was simply that Bryn Mawr was very consciously adhering to, or it appears that they're really invested in this singular narrative. And this is an academic, very intellectual community. And so I think it's just worth, being aware of just the conscious construction of our story and our own ownership of that story. So now we arrive back at 2016 again. Our recent alumni have just sat through this convocation. They've sat through Founders Day for the umpteenth time, and now through a convocation that's revealing what has not really been hidden to anyone who might look, but that hasn't been included in the story about the racism of our founders. I'm curious, before we get into what happened formally in terms of a response and a retelling and an opening of storytelling, what was your first outlet for protest? What was the first, where did you first register feelings as students at Bryn Mawr in 2016?
If I can just quickly add before that, I think that there's more to understand what happened in 2016 too, in just terms of the context, that particularly after the election, tensions with Gilman were incredibly high. And if I had to describe the 2016 to 2017 school year in a nutshell, I'd say it was a dumpster fire. It was a truly terrible school year. I think almost everyone who was at the school, certainly in the upper school, both faculty and students would tell you that was true. And we returned from winter break, tensions were especially high after a scandal at Gilman that was deeply sexist and upsetting to the student body. And right after the end of the semester, so at the end of January, we actually had several days where the school sort of came to a stop, and we had to sit down and have dedicated days of diversity training. And I think the fact that Bryn Mawr had to sit down and do that tells you a lot about how high tensions were in the community and how many problems there were on a variety of fronts, including racism and sexism. and then throw into that mix, suddenly there's a convocation about how racist the founders are, and the whole thing just sort of explodes even more.
And for people that don't know, maybe Katrina, I don't know, maybe no one wants to say it, but the Gilman thing was pretty stunning. It was a plastic blow up like sex doll that was being pummeled and pushed and having sexual sort of gestures made. And this was all filmed. This happened in the Gilman Senior Room, which is now has windows carved into it, I understand. But and this was put on, you know, like some little film, and it appears on people's cell phones throughout the community. I myself was walking in to teach a US history class when someone runs up to me, and I'm suddenly looking at a bunch of boys who could easily just be down, you know, in my class, jumping up and down, you know, banging this like naked. It really incredible. I think I've never seen in all my years of teaching anything like that year of what that felt like.
Yeah, so I guess what I'll say is that I guess outlet for my outlet was really found in my community, in the Black Student Union. I know a lot of students at the time, as Katrina said, there were high tensions. And so I guess as the administration's attempt to kind of get a hold of the student body, I believe that they said things and they sent out various letters that felt as if they were silencing a part of the community. And so a lot of students felt as if Bryn Mawr wasn't really a school that had that prioritized the safety of all students. And so I think for me as a Black student in that such a turbulent time, I really found community within the Black Student Union that I was actually co-leading with Milan and one other student, Kira Bennett. And so we tried to do things and have various club meetings that were kind of dedicated towards education, but uplifting and self-care.
I have to agree with India. I think during that time, there weren't that many outlets for protests. And I think if there were, the idea of what a protest meant that it had to be kind of safe and careful and thought out. And I think a lot like that notion of I guess controlling the student voice kind of led to the, I guess you can say, outburst of 2016 and 2017, where students didn't feel heard, so didn't feel heard by administration, so they had to make sure that they were heard through different letters and things like that. And I think that, I don't know, I think it was very complicated because I think after that year, 2016, 2017, the senior class was kind of demonized by, I guess, the school. And I think looking back, I had a lot of respect for them, and I still do, because I think back then it was kind of, well, you see how like during the past summer, like you saw how activism and the idea of Black Lives Matter and that phrase has been made sort of safe by companies and institutions feeling more comfortable using it. And I think that back then it was a very different kind of social landscape, and people were seen as, I guess, troublemakers or kind of annoying by bringing up these problems. And I think that real protests and demands, which we weren't always given access to, are supposed to make people feel comfortable. And I think that's important, especially when you're requesting change from a place like Bryn Mawr. So I think looking back, I don't think there were very good outlets for protests. So
Wasn't there a die-in? Could you say something about that was then it happened, and then it seemed to me, I mean, maybe I just heard it, but that there was then even parent pushback, like this shouldn't happen in school kind of thing. Katrina, does this ringing a bell? Do you remember this?
yeah, the die-in happened my freshman year in
Oh, okay, it was earlier then. All right.
2013. Yeah.
But I mean, I remember in 2017 for Black History Month, Black Student Union had every year we would paint various windows, either gym lobby windows or windows right in front of the quad. And so kind of our statement was we had put defined genocide, and we had put names of victims of police brutality. And I think we had done that on like a Friday. And so over the weekend, it was actually erased by, I guess it was the administration's decision, but it was erased. And so we weren't really informed about that until someone had sent us a picture of it, but we didn't know that that was occurring. So I think it was just a lot of pushback from students, and I think that they were trying to preserve or satisfy parents or just protect themselves from what could come from any pushback from various different communities.
A student at the time that the windows were erased told me that she was told that it was to protect the lower schoolers.
I think that was said. Mhm.
And as a parent of a lower schooler and as a parent who's been engaged this year among friends in conversation about how critical it is that diversity efforts begin in the lower school, I just wanted to put a pin in the idea that we're protecting lower schoolers by erasing a memorial window.
I think just to speak for Talia, I mean, because I just remember standing there in front of these windows with Talia Titus at the time having a massive discussion about it. And I know she personally thought, I think, you guys, is this true? Were there, because I didn't see it, were there pictures of people who maybe were like dead bodies? Was that involved? I just remember, no, okay, Arena, I just remember Talia saying like, because she had a daughter in the lower school. So she was sort of speaking from her heart about feeling like, I just don't want to walk my daughter by this. I just don't want to. I mean, that was her.
Yeah, I mean, I guess those sentiments, thinking about them, kind of discusses or touches on our desire to want to preserve and not really discuss and deal with what the reality is.
No, I agree.
And I think Bryn Mawr has done that a lot in the past. And I think that's kind of what led to the events of 2017 into the 2017 school year, not that desire to kind of do what would be easy up front, but really leads to a lot of pain and a big uproar later on that, you know, brews for a long time until it can't, and then it explodes.
And I think what Milan and India have articulated really well was that by the time we got to 2017, students had so few outlets to vent their frustration that that year became the year of open letters that would appear on walls, saying experiences of things that had happened. And convocation speeches became one of the main outlets for students because you had access to the entire upper school. And it was one of the few times when you could actually have your voice heard. And so you end up with something like the windows, which were simply a way for students to express themselves and to raise important issues of history. And to my memory, it was simply just a window with names in black. And then yet again, the school takes it down and silences these students, and you're left with nothing again. There's no recognition for why that story is important to tell, or any sort of recognition of how we can help the students who we've now impacted. It's simply it's done, it's over, let's move on.
So without creating an impression that the steps that were taken after the events of 2016 have solved the really difficult issues that were just raised, I do want to give air to them because I think they are an important part of an effort toward reconciliation. And again, in the spirit that this is the beginning of a conversation. Kim, will you tell us about the project that began in 2017, and I think, and how it related to the sentiment on campus, examining our past?
Well, I think that just from everything everyone has heard, you can see that it was just clear. I think to everyone in the history department, and I was the department chair at that point in time, and Arena was there as well, that we had a lot of claims about history being made, that people would, we had convocations, multiple ones where people would say things or talk about their curriculum. And I think it just seemed to me like we needed clarity, we needed information, we needed to get students involved. And we really needed to open this conversation up and start thinking about how we tell the narrative of Bryn Mawr. It just seemed like it was erupting at every turn, and that the old narrative, I mean, you just couldn't possibly have gone on with it. At the same time, I don't think any of us knew. I mean, Irina, when you say, like, we did a lot of research to try to understand, well, what really is the history? What really was it? What were the founders' views? You know, how can we find out? So the school has these grants called innovation grants. And so we wrote one and spent the summer trying to get a base of research, and then had this idea that we could draw some students in as well and get them to examine different parts of the school. For a period of time, we were really trying to do alumni interviews. And I was really interested in that, in creating a much bigger oral history base. And I still am, but it was, I have to say, pretty overwhelming. There were a lot of people that wanted to be interviewed. And then, you know, oral history can be very tricky because I think how people remember and what they tell you what they remember is often constructed to reflect well upon them. And I was surprised. I mean, if I were to be, all right, I'll just be honest, most of my interviews, and I had sort of many alone with people also that I just knew, were really narratives of guilt absolution. So that all the people who were in the past at Bryn Mawr, who were white, who was the vast majority of people who wanted to speak, wanted to tell you all the reasons why they were not prejudiced, why they disliked racism, why they, you know, always felt that way, or their family had felt that way. And that story, I mean, we could probably write a book on that narrative, like on why do we have to, I mean, all I could see in my mind is we're constructing a whole new narrative, again, about why we're not bad people. And so I, to be honest, didn't know what to do with that, and then have a full-time job and, like, you know, other things happening. So it just became kind of overwhelming. And also, like, yeah, where would we go with it? It would be interesting. I mean, I'm still, part of my mind is very intrigued by the need, and also an intense need often to tell the story about how great I am. I mean, Katrina, would you say that some of them that you heard had some of that going?
I would agree with that. I did several oral history interviews, and one story that stands out to me was an alumna who was absolutely focused on telling us that her friend had been half Jewish,
Yeah.
and that she had been in support of Jewish students at the school. I think this was prior to any Black students, and that her family supported Jews, and that they were, you know, supportive of all races, of all religions, and that they were a good family.
Yep. You would imagine that Bryn Mawr was the most liberal place on the planet based on the memory of
And one of the most, it's so fascinating to hear the issues that you grapple with as a historian with this material. But one of the most effective and affecting outcomes, I think, of this project has been the project that Milan and India spearheaded, which doesn't take a perspective at all. It lets a story tell itself. Can you tell us about the Black Alumni Yearbook, how it came about and what it means to you? And I hope Melissa's maybe shared a link, or would share a link so that people can view it. It's so powerful.
Okay, I'll start. So the Black Alumni Yearbook was India and I senior project. So we spent, usually people get internships or work in kind of like the field that they're interested in, but we decided to collect the pictures of all the Black students that graduated from Bryn Mawr starting in 1968 when Ursel Thatcher graduated, because 2018, we're the class of 2018, that was 50 years after. So it was the 50th anniversary of her graduation. So in the beginning of the book, if you all have time to look at it, it says for the first, so there could be many. So that was kind of like our reasoning behind it. So we made this book as a kind of dedication to Ursel Datcher and all the people that came before us, because we kind of viewed them as our founders. Like we were talking about, the founders of Bryn Mawr didn't exactly envision us as a Bryn Mawr student, but because of their experiences, or Ursel Datcher's experiences, and all the other Black students that graduated, we were able to come to Bryn Mawr and like spend our high school years there. And I know that for me personally, I was only at Bryn Mawr for 4 years, but I still see it as a part of me, and I still see myself in it and in its history and its current history. Oh, sorry. And yeah, so that's kind of why we created it, as a kind of
Any
dedication
resources
to the
that
people
offer
that
us to
came
do that, except
before
for
us,
looking
and to
through the yearbooks and just looking at the Black girls who had came before us. And so I know that this book for me kind of provides something that's concrete for students that graduate after me to look